Oh my gosh, friends, I got out of autistic burnout, and so can you! If you just buy my book, hire me for coaching I'm unqualified to do, or just take more breaks, obviously. Sorry for the jump scare, friends, but today we're talking about autistic burnout. My name is Corn, and I use they, them pronouns, by the way. And unlike every white, low support need autistic influencer pushing that false narrative, we're gonna have an honest talk about why this is harmful, what burnout is and isn't, and what it means to actually break free of these cycles as a disabled person. And spoiler, it's not that easy. And while I'd like you to watch this whole video in its entirety, also feel free to navigate using the chapters on this video too. Part 1. What is autistic burnout? For context, autistic burnout is a relatively newer term, and there isn't a whole lot of research to support it as a formal diagnosis or condition, but it has been a term getting a lot of traction in autistic communities, and for good reason. If you search this on the internet, you're probably going to hear something along these lines. Autistic burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic life stress and a mismatch of expectations and abilities without adequate supports. It is characterized by pervasive, long-term, typically 3+ months, exhaustion, loss of function, and reduced tolerance to stimulus. Thanks to Katie Oswald over at Stanford Medicine for providing that definition. Now, I don't know this person or their scope of work, but I quite like this definition because I think it has an important distinction of both accounting for chronic life stress and a mismatch of inadequate supports, abilities, and expectations. What do I mean by this? Well, when we talk about autistic burnout, it always raises the question of how is autistic burnout different than regular burnout? I mean, what makes it autistic? And that is directly answered by the addition of challenges specific to autistic needs, like constantly dealing with increased or decreased sensory input, executive dysfunction, social and communication differences, masking autistic traits by having to constantly perform and be uncomfortable to fit in, or having cumulative unmet needs and accommodations in some or all parts of your life. When we compare this to what is thought of as regular burnout, the biggest distinction is that regular burnout is connected to chronic life stressors that affect all of us. Probably overworking is the biggest. It also can be trying to do too much or spreading yourself too thin, pushing yourself past your limits. A note that dealing with constant racism, harassment, and discrimination as a marginalized person can amplify this as well. These chronic life stressors compound with autistic life stressors to create a unique but absolutely debilitating combination of burnout that is autistic burnout. But yes, people experience any type of burnout are of course going to feel extra tired, irritable, and potentially experience depression, anxiety, and other negative effects on their health and happiness as a result. But the severity of autistic burnout is a little bit different. Autistic folks who are in burnout will experience pretty drastic changes to their everyday capabilities. They may be completely unable to do or deeply struggle with tasks they could do before, have significantly more shutdowns and meltdowns, react more easily to sensory stimuli, and more. But it's important to understand that burnout doesn't look one way. Especially when we consider the wide range of autistic support needs, someone else's baseline can look wildly different than yours or even mine. But for the purposes of categorization, you can also think of these effects in broader categories. Physical, like chronic stress, pain, trouble sleeping, or interoception issues. Cognitive, like issues with focusing or difficulty making decisions. Or emotional, like feeling drastically more overwhelmed, anxious, or upset, and difficulty processing and communicating these feelings. And mind you, these are all things that most autistic folks already struggle with, making it even more challenging to identify and even more challenging to remedy. But from my experience, most neurotypical folks, not all, can keep their burnout in check or manage it much better by just reducing their responsibilities, taking breaks, working less, all the things that people tell you to do when you're struggling, which, mind you, are still difficult if you need to pay your bills. And while those changes can certainly help a lot of autistic people who are experiencing this type of burnout, if you do not address or accommodate those specific autistic life stressors, you will not get better. If you do not accommodate your sensory needs, your communication differences, your preference for sameness, you will struggle no matter how many tasks you take off your plate. And that is so important to understand if you're trying to address it. You need to understand what is actually causing it. For clarity, I went nearly 2 years struggling through autistic burnout with severe depression, anxiety, and insomnia in the meantime, which some could argue I was misdiagnosed, but I do believe I did have all those issues too. I was just missing the diagnosis of autism and ADHD too. And because of that, no matter what meds I took or how many hours I took off work, I couldn't shake that chronic feeling of exhaustion and dysfunction. And sometimes I feel like I'll never, even though things have drastically gotten better for me. Is autistic burnout unique to just autistic people? What about other neurodivergent and greater disabled folks? Personally, I don't find it unique at all. I think there's a very strong argument to say that probably every disabled person experiences burnout unique to their disability, both from unmet needs and societal ableism compounded by life stressors. It's of course not the same exact reasons as an autistic person, but there certainly would be reasons based on their disability. Also, many autistic folks like myself have co-occurring or additional disabilities that compound these issues. We've also seen phrases like ADHD burnout gain popularity, and it generally does make me wonder if we've only seen the rise of specific terms for autism and ADHD because of their increased traction and palatability. Unfortunately, autism and ADHD have become the face of neurodivergence in recent years, when we know neurodivergent is quite a large umbrella term that describes all sorts of disabilities: BPD, DID, Down syndrome, FASD, PTSD, epilepsy, and much more. And that's not even considering the larger community of all disabled folks who also experience chronic stress and dysregulation from unmet accessibility needs and living in disabled bodies in a disability-hostile world. So no, I'm not gatekeeping the idea of disability-specific burnout at all, and I think we should normalize this topic for all disabled folks. Part 2. Why are most conversations on autistic burnout problematic? I think this is largely in part because people have always found ways to monetize quick but ultimately poor solutions to very complex problems, especially when they involve vulnerable populations. Because respectfully, it's good for business, but it really sucks when it comes from people in our communities. Nearly every low support autistic and ADHD creator I have seen has at some point put out pretty predatory content on burnout. Oh, I overcame burnout. Just buy my book for $29.99 where I tell it all. Buy my burnout recovery toolkit for just $200. And now I offer one-on-one consulting services that I'm not at all qualified to do. And all these products repackage the very same advice that is freely being shared. Take more breaks, use accommodations, unmask your autistic traits, just use a planner. Okay, and? But what they don't tell you is that they make 6 figures a year, have lower support needs than you, and can make all of those changes in their life pretty easily and without repercussions. And they have everything to gain from hiding all that from you to sell you something you ultimately don't need. And if there's one thing that you can take away from this entire video, it's that if something sounds too good to be true, it definitely is. And I don't blame disabled people for falling for these schemes because we want to believe it. We want the world to be easier for us, and we deserve it. We see other people who seem to have it figured out and think, why can't I do that? What's wrong with me? We want to be able to trust these people who honestly work very hard to portray themselves as experts, even though they're absolutely not. Just because you are autistic does not mean you understand the experiences of all autistic folk, and even less so that you're qualified to be coaching and guiding other autistic people based on your lived experiences alone. There's a reason why people go to school, study, and need qualifications to facilitate meaningful therapies for disabled folks. And that's not gatekeeping, that's protecting vulnerable communities from predatory social media coaches. And honestly, this increased pipeline of newly diagnosed autistic and ADHD folks to coaches to teaching other people how to coach is terrifying. And I get it. They're just trying to get their bag because they realize that making honest and nuanced content on disability justice doesn't always pay the bills. But I hate it. It exploits our communities, and I know so many folks who have given what little money they have to people like this to only be told that their problems are too complex or too difficult. But the reality is, being disabled is both complex and difficult. Part 3. How do we actually get out of autistic burnout? Now, if you skip to this part of the video, I have some not so great news for you. There's no one thing you can do or buy to suddenly get you out of autistic burnout. That's the truth. And I don't say that to go, oh well, guess you should give up then. I say that to be realistic about expectations for yourself so you can actually make meaningful changes in your life and acknowledge what is out of your control, which is a lot. But maybe I lied, because there is in fact one thing that can get you out of autistic burnout, and that's privilege. And that comes in many forms: race, sexuality, gender, but also in time, resources, and money. Oh, need to work less hours? Well, now you can't pay your bills. Need accommodations at work? Well, they said no, and now you're facing retaliation for it. Make a little too much money? And now you don't qualify for your disability benefits either, but also you can't afford them out of pocket. These systems are inherently designed to funnel us into 2 crappy scenarios as disabled people. If you have low enough of supports, you're forced to overwork at the expense of your health and happiness, which ultimately you will not be able to do long term, and they will blame you for. If you have too high of supports, you're forced into a cycle of poverty to literally qualify for life-saving supports, but you're just ungrateful, right? And if you're somewhere in between, which is a lot of people, that's too bad. They don't care. And although the disability benefit system is deeply flawed with many barriers to access, formal diagnosis is still the only way to get these accommodations, making it crucial. The reality is, the only way to bypass these systems is privilege. If you have the ability to shop around for a better job, to not have to qualify for life-saving care, to be able to request supports without repercussion, that's great. But I say this as someone who only got out of the worst parts of burnout by making more money, living more comfortably, and being able to quite literally make my own job to accommodate myself, that it was the only way I was able to get out of this cycle. And what is so incredibly relevant to this conversation is that I have low support needs. Not no supports, but lower supports and higher support needs autistic people. Not every autistic person is capable of doing what I can do, even with all the supports in the world, and that is a huge privilege, and one that so many creators forget to acknowledge when they share all of their achievements as something everyone can do, when sometimes they can't. That's why I think it's so important to have that transparency when you are showing your lifestyle online, especially as a disabled person. Now, are there still things you can do to prevent and aid autistic burnout? Absolutely. If you're already in an immense state of autistic burnout, it's very likely that you'll need outside intervention or care. I'm not qualified to tell you what you should do, and I'll be completely honest about that. I'm not your doctor or healthcare professional, and I still know that healthcare professionals can really suck as someone navigating the US healthcare system. But I can tell you that if you have any type of support system, a friend, a partner, a parent, a caretaker, a trusted adult, please let them know what's going on. Now, what I can tell you is that if you're unsure you're experiencing autistic burnout, here's some early signs I notice in myself. Extreme fatigue, feeling more irritated than usual, heightened sensory sensitivity, struggling more than usual with daily tasks. I'd notice I'd have more issues eating safe foods, communicating, and would feel this sort of fog over my life. If that's you, you may be like, okay, so what do I do now? Well, addressing these issues means addressing both facets of autistic burnout, chronic life stressors and autistic life stressors. And unfortunately, while some of these aspects may be under our control, a lot aren't. But that doesn't mean it's a lost cause to reduce some of the burdens you can control. Unmasking your autistic traits and not using all of your energy to appear neurotypical all the time will probably help too. Do question the internal thoughts that tell you have to act a specific way to fit in, make eye contact, avoid these topics, don't look uncomfortable, not fidget, and so on. These systems do protect us, but they also can come at a great cost of using our energy. But let's always keep in mind that Black and brown folks can't always unmask, especially with the valid fear of exhibiting traits in public and being harmed or killed for it. It also can be a privilege at all to mask in the first place when high support need folks can't, but that isn't to invalidate the burden of masking at all. I could just honestly make a whole video on masking and unmasking autistic traits because there's so much nuance there, and I probably will down the line. Making accommodations for yourself will definitely help, but I know particularly for me, it was hard to figure out what those accommodations even were in the first place. It took a lot of trial and error to figure out what I needed, and unfortunately that process can be quite unique and personal to every autistic person. Also, even figuring out what those accommodations are doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have access to them easily. No, you can avoid these situations altogether, but it may allow you to be more prepared for them and know what to expect. For example, grocery stores are too overwhelming for me, so I do order pickup. I know my dog's barking will send me into a meltdown, so I always have my noise-canceling headphones on me at all times. I know I struggle with eating new foods, so I eat the same foods every day to make it easier for me. I note as well that my partner supports me through cooking all my meals and handling a lot of admin tasks that are chronic life stressors for me. And you may relate to those examples, you may not, and that's totally okay. And regardless of what those examples are for you, it's less so about navigating each one successfully, but acknowledging them in the first place that allows you to have kindness for yourself when you experience these difficulties. There's not going to be an accommodation for every issue you deal with, but we can develop better supports for when things go awry. Having predetermined plans with loved ones for when you go into a meltdown or shutdown, having supports and comfort items always on hand, small things can go a long way, and they're ultimately better than nothing. I think this reframing also allows us to shift the blame from ourselves and put the blame, rightfully so, on our governments, on our corrupt healthcare systems, on capitalism, and all the systems that force us to individually find solutions to universal issues that could be improved through better policies and care. Systems that work so hard to ensure we fail. But just remember, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. You're just disabled. Yes, we're disabled by society, by ableism, by even our own bodies, but that doesn't make us any less worthy of care, respect, or agency. We all benefit from accessibility, helping the most marginalized, and we will keep fighting for and demanding until we have the supports we all need. Bye, friends. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and follow me on all my platforms for semi-daily content.